much. It might change a bit, of course, but it's not going to change much. At that point, I start, the Manley Vari-Mu will go across the mix bus. Either the outboard hardware version, which I absolutely love, or the plugin, which almost replicates it. I mean, it does better than anything else does. But the way I abuse the Manley Vari-Mu across anything that I use it on. So, and then it's usually that Pultec, the UAD Pultec Pro Legacy. Man, that thing is so musical. It's just ridiculous, the things it will pull into and out of a mix. And so I find that to be a great finishing EQ on the mix bus. However, for those that don't know who are using it, it does give you a slight volume and presence bump in the mid-range. But I usually like that as a finisher because I usually find, after you've been mixing for a while, a little bit of extra mid-range sometimes just makes your mix pop a little bit more. And as soon as you put it on, you're like, oh, no, too much. No, something else. Or, oh, that's nice. And then you go fishing.
Yeah. I love how you phrased it as pulling it out of the mix as opposed to pushing it into as opposed to pushing the mix into the EQ. You're pulling musical information out of the mix with your stereo bus.
Yeah. It's, I think if you bypassed all of the plugins on my stereo bus, it wouldn't sound like a mix anymore. Which I don't see as a bad thing. It's just the fact that I mix a lot into the stereo bus and I shape a lot of what I do into the stereo bus. But for anybody still paying attention, here comes a big, gigantic cheat code. If you're trying to get your mixes really, really loud, it's best to start tailoring your mix bus long before you need to make those final decisions, because, if you get yourself into audio problems, especially with the low end early on, and you start treating your mix bus, then you have plenty of time to course correct and make everything work together like glue by the time you have to hit a finish line. Whereas if you mix, and then at the very end, you're going to be like, okay, now I'm going to master. And then your master doesn't come together at all. You're like, oh. My philosophy is like, if you want a nice, big, loud mix, you've got to build that loudness in stages as you go and make sure that it's not just loud for loud's sake. It's that it's loud and clear and present and undistorted and not too pushed and still musical. And that's really hard to do. And I think that's why a lot of people are pissed off about the loudness wars, because it's really fucking hard to get things to sound really great, really loud. But certainly possible.
So I'm assuming you're mixing into like heavy limiting based on that statement.
Yeah, but then once my clients approve a mix, I'll feed an unlimited pass to the mastering engineer and let them do their job.
Amazing.
And yeah, usually mastering is a pretty easy day for whoever gets my mixes, but
you don't leave them much.
Usually not, but I mean, so I'm very often impressed with the results that I get back, because it's not like, so you gotta understand that while I am mastering while I mix, I'm not trying to make it mastered. And the only difference there is, especially on your first mix, you don't want to pigeonhole yourself so completely finished and limited that your client comes back and says, I love the mix. Can you turn up the kick and the bass?
Right.
And then you're like, well, if you would like everything very noticeably quieter, I can definitely do that. And then they're like, what the fuck, dude? They don't understand the physics of, ones and zeros and brick walls. So I leave myself a little bit of wiggle room at the very maximum loudness. And then I usually don't push it much more after that, because I'll give the mastering engineer an extra dB or two to go. They usually don't need it. But I try and mix to basically as finished as I can get it, because I need to know what it's going to sound like on the radio before my client does. I want to know that Absolutely. They can hit play and go like, holy shit. Yes. Okay.
it's so interesting also because we're referencing masters when, if we're listening to other music, that's our reference, mastered mixes, you know what I mean?
Right.
So it's so interesting to like mix with that in mind. And like,
that's what your client is referencing it against.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, that's the thing that mixers got to realize is like, okay, you can know the tech and know after this is mastered, it's going to sound like this, but most likely your client doesn't. And they're going to listen to it against their other very favorite song that they have binge listened to since the day it came out 2 years ago that slaughters your mix in volume. If only yours was turned up, yours would compete. You can't explain that to people. You just gotta deliver it to people that way.
Yeah. Wild. If you don't mind, I wanted to ask you a little bit about your approach to low end because, your stuff is super punchy. Do you, are you thinking about anything in particular when you're trying to like get the low end right, or do you have any particular techniques that you tend to use?
I think a big key in that is what I just described with building the mix bus. Because
Sure.
the hardest thing to get big and loud in a mix is the low end, and especially the sub, because sub frequencies drive your RMS harder than anything else. So if you're kind of building your mix bus in stages and you know what you're doing and it works for you, you can build loudness into the low end without it becoming too heavy and overweighted. But, aside from that, you have to be... Here's one thing that very few people know unless you've watched my show. On mixing night, I've shown this a few times with checking your phase on your one shots. So one thing I've noticed that very few people ever do, but almost always get thrown into is you have several kick drums playing at the same time on a pattern, almost always nowadays in productions. And those kicks, even one shots that have no relationship to each other, they have a phase relationship to each other, and they will affect the sound of one another, and sometimes they'll reinforce and sometimes they'll cancel. And the very first thing that I typically do with a heavy low end is I check the phase on the kicks, and I run a phase alignment on something like Sound Radix Auto Align. I found is really great for something like that. And I'll run auto align on like all the kick one shots and all the snare one shots. It doesn't always improve it, but really quickly yes or no. And you just have to listen. It runs, an auto detect, and it scans it, and it says what it's basically trying to do is find the very smartest alignment for the transients and also the phase relationship of the transients. So it's aligning the phase as well as the timing and locking in the best relationship on that. And the impact to your low end, I mean, the look on people's faces when I show them this shit is usually like, oh, I've been doing it wrong this whole time. Oh my God. Because just all of a sudden not always, all of a sudden your kicks can just really come to life. They have more weight, they have more power, they have more sub, they sustain, they hit, all because you corrected phase long before you thought about touching an equalizer. And that's just
that old school analog knowledge, in a modern day, context. I actually do that often. Is I'll just nudge it, I'll just move the waveform until I see that the up wave is like in line or something, and just make sure it sounds better.
Yeah, I'll do that a lot, especially just with vocals. If I'm just aligning vocals by hand, sometimes I'll use auto align. Is it Vocaline?
Vocaline, yeah, sure.
But I find Vocaline kind of gets too precise sometimes. So I like doing it by hand and keeping things a little bit looser when I'm doing background vocals and stuff like that.
You lose some of the magic when things are too tight. Yeah,
I think that's a big difference between music now and music. Kind of when I got started in the music industry, there was no auto-tune. And even though things were starting to come out of boxes a whole lot more, even way back then, things still weren't so pitch perfect as they are today. And
totally.
I don't remember ever listening to a song that I loved in the 80s or 90s that and going like, oh, the vocal's out of tune. But so many of those songs nowadays you would listen to with today's dialed in ears and go, they didn't hear that? whoa. I mean, they are so out of tune. Nobody cared back then. It was a different time. Not everything wasn't so pitch perfect, and people's ears have gotten so comfortable and familiar with auto-tune that sometimes what I've found is when you feed them something that's not quite so, it can really be expanding. And I've found like I have a Rolly that I love for that. And for those that don't know, the Rolly is like that black rubber keyboard that gets all the in-between notes.
Right.
And you can play like violins and shit on it as if they were like you had it in your hands and you were a virtuoso. It's ridiculous. But I find the power of something like a Rolly to be able to just kind of get slightly in between notes can just really bring magic to productions in ways that playing a regular keyboard on a regular pad that's perfectly coming out of a regular box is just not doing anymore. And I'm always looking for like really signature stuff in our productions when we're producing.
That's amazing. Yeah, I feel like we got to get into quarter tones. Maybe that'll get us out of our auto-tune funk. It's our ears have become too fine-tuned, and I think that if I'm pulling up Melodyne, I'll often just go too far because I'm so used to hearing everything so in pitch that sometimes you lose some of that magic in the vocal by over tuning.
Right? Yeah,
it's a real problem.
I almost, when I'm producing, let's put it this way, I think Melodyne is an incredible tool. I almost never use it because I try not to produce singers that can't sing, and I comp through autotune, which I find very important. So I'm listening to tuning corrected performances while I'm comping vocals and listening to all of the different takes. So I'm listening to 7 takes that might all be slightly out of tune. But gently corrected, I can hear the true emotion in the performance, and I
love
can
that.
know, you know what I mean?
That's such a great tip.
Oh, it's changes everything. Totally changes everything. And I guarantee you, I've showed people this to jaw drops. If you just bypass my auto-tune on almost any vocal comp I do, you will be like, not the same singer. Impossible. And it's just, everything is out of tune. And then you hear it with just a little bit of, it's a tool. It's just people freak out about auto-tune. It's a tool. It just gently pulls people into tune virtually seamlessly anymore. And, and it allows all of the best emotion of the song to come through as opposed to trying to set the bar so high that both the emotion and the tuning and the rhythm and everything have to be pitch perfect coming out of the mouth. Like
You've just completely flipped a switch in my brain of how I comp vocals and judge a performance and Melodyne. I'm really gonna thank you. I'm gonna think about that.
You're welcome.
That's amazing. How did your relationship with BTS start? Like, you've done a lot of mixes for them?
I've done 36 mixes for BTS.
Yeah. How did that begin? And what's it like working with that kind of music?
So yeah, I've been working with BTS since before their first album. I mixed their first album. They flew over here. The owner of Big Hit Entertainment, the lead Hitman, the lead producer, P-Dog, and one of the other producers came over here to finish the first album with me, and that kind of set the tone for I've worked on virtually every album since then. And it's just an absolute first-class camp to deal with. I mean, everybody is super nice. Everybody is super professional. They're on point. They deliver shit when they say they're going to deliver it. It is so well prepared. It's like, you wish you could get stuff like that from others. And and they deliver you like really concise mix notes that guide you very well. And they have English speakers, so the translation is no problem at all. And, musically, the thing that I've always loved about BTS is that they got to where they got by being different than everybody else, not by trying to chase what everybody else was doing, but by being totally different. And they've always really gravitated towards more emotional vocal performances and more emotional tracks with like orchestrations and things like that, and more kind of lush sounds. And, not always. They do a lot of the pop, straight up pop stuff too, obviously, but they are just